Well, thank you very much for coming here, everybody. And it's a tough act to follow because it's not going to be sort of so live and dramatic. But this is also somewhat of a personal story. It's a story of a project that I did 2 years ago, a competition I didn't win. A competition I won, but then somebody else who didn't participate in it won, which is, as always, or often happens when you're involved in something in Russia. But so it's about subways. And subways for me, like again, it's kind of personal fascination to some degree. I sort of think of them as kind of modern day city gates. And here's obviously Porta Pia, which actually James showed yesterday, strangely enough, on the cover of Complexity and Contradiction, which is like, I mean, that's why Porta Pia comes up when I start thinking of city gates. I mean, it's obviously there are mythologies associated with these things. You know, the breach of the gate by the Bersaglieri and all sorts of signs, and you know, so these things existed and clearly signified transition between kind of the city and beyond. And these days, I mean, Saul Steinberg probably sort of sums it up more like this. I mean, the subway entrance is probably as much as a kind of a transition, a gate between a kind of a place and another place, but they tend to be essentially holes in the ground, like shown in the drawing of Union Square. But then there is this one place in the world which these things are not quite sort of so stripped down and maybe so utilitarian, and also have their own mythologies as well. So this is actually the first subway station in Moscow, now known as Kropotkinskaya, before it was known as the Palace of the Soviet, before the thing was built. And you've probably seen, many of you have seen these images. I'm just kind of showing you the context of in which we ended up having to work. This is a newer station, which obviously has to do with Dostoevsky. And the interesting thing there, the reason why I'm showing it to you, like these things are full of signage, but not the signage that actually orients you to where you're supposed to go. So there's like this little thing in there that you can sort of see, and then this old lady's trying to figure out where the hell she's going. If you're foreign tourists and you don't know the language, you're like really not in a good shape there. I mean, some of the newer stations have some kind of Latin-based signage, but for the most part, there's kind of other sets of mythologies that are clearly of interest to people who are designing these things. This was fairly recent kind of a controversy. The restoration of Kurskaya station included the restoration of the verses from the Soviet Union anthem that basically glorifies Stalin, and a lot of people freaked out over this. But at the same time, a lot of people were like really happy to see it. So there clearly was a kind of an interesting sort of conflict there. But for the most part, like I said, the signage has other let's say goals in life, some kind of glorifications, some kind of memories, some kind of allusions to sort of enormity or drive or I don't know, excitement kind of associated with this grand experiment of the Soviet Union, and its heirs now. So this is actually, but at the same time, these subway stations also tend to develop their own kind of vernacular traditions. So this one, the famous one, the Revolutionary Square, has all these statues, and apparently it's good luck to rob the dog. So the dog is really shiny because everybody does it. So anyway, so this was this is the kind of context, and we were invited to participate in this competition for a new set of subway stations that they're developing a second ring line. So in the context of the city, in a way, hasn't changed. I mean, it's still this kind of circular thing, circular, kind of like a pizza pie, if you like. I mean, there's Kremlin in the middle, and you can see the subway kind of reflects on it. So this is that new line that they're currently starting to build, the new circle. And as far as any kind of consistency of imagery, that letter M seems to persist very much. And I mean, it's going through some kind of changes, but it's even when the subway was still being built, the letter M was already there. So M, the red M, is a very kind of prominent M for metro. You can see it on kind of all sorts of things here. But at the same time, there is no necessarily consistency of kind of appearances both above ground and below ground. So this is kind of some of the ranges from the really kind of spectacular ones to the on the upper left, not so spectacular. This is just a kind of one of my favorite little sculptures that Aleksandr Brodsky did. M for Metro again. But anyway, so, and this is kind of some of the early drawings from that Metro story published in the 30s. But so this is, the contemporary context is this. They essentially, they don't have the money to do this again, this kind of glorified stuff. So they bought pre-designed subway stations. Well, they bought designs from Spain. So this is typical, this is what we were given. And the layers in CAD were actually in Spanish still. So this is kind of a typical Madrileño station that we were supposed to somehow adapt to a new context. And we're also told, okay, no budget, existing station, no context really either, because this kind of area of the city where we're working is still being developed. So who knows what's there? Nothing at the moment. So, immediately we started kind of thinking of sort of other precedents, like other sort of ways of dealing with the situation. And of course, kind of in a way, a full circle, because at some point when in the 30s, when the Russians were developing their own subway system, of course they sent people to study New York subway. And I mean, New York, obviously, signage, I would say, is probably the most, I like to say, the saving grace, the kind of the most prevalent situation there. The kind of utility of it, or put it this way, it goes beyond utility into kind of its own art, especially after we nearly redesigned this thing. But there are also these other things. There are these kind of intrusions by kind of other moments. And then there's also, speaking of precedents, so this is stations in Stockholm. Color. Color could be a really important, sort of powerful thing. And like I said, also there is this kind of a language of warning signs and materials and patterns that could potentially be, I think, kind of constructive, or at least iconic. So, with that in mind, so this is the material palette. Basically, it had to be all the local materials, so we couldn't use anything, God forbid, produced by the NATO countries. We essentially kind of went with what they had. They had the stone, fine, so we'll use the stone. They had these kind of safety tile, like, all right, we'll use a safety tile, and they use wood. And we said, okay, we'll use wood, but maybe we'll kind of dye it and use colors. And somehow colors started to really kind of come up. And also this idea that the studded tile could also become maybe sometimes a light, sometimes a safety surface. But this is where the kind of the memories started to creep up for me. I mean, I grew up there and I lived there until I was 15. This is kind of a mnemonic device that basically every kid knows, and it's like every hunter wants to know where sits the pheasant, which basically it's a memory device, a mnemonic device to remember the colors of the rainbow. So each first letter corresponds to the color. And then there's also this kind of other thing, which is this kind of giant collective memory, which is the byproduct of the essentially a collective education system. So this is like a standard textbook that basically everybody used. I mean, I remember this one still. So across plus or minus 9,000 kilometers, the educational system more or less remains the same. And then in those textbooks, you had these pictures. And these pictures, you were supposed to kind of write essays about them. And, to this day, I remember this thing. It's in Tretyakov Gallery. It's, the 1871, 3 hunters talking about, hopefully, pheasants. And that's kind of, again, from the depth of this somewhat sort of inflamed collective memory, I started to realize that maybe one can construct something that's not necessarily kind of lavish, expensive, marbled, or statuarized, but something that still kind of refers to some sort of the past, the childhood, the kind of first day of school, like the things that were somehow kind of good and fuzzy. So, and this was essentially the proposal that the colors will start with red and kind of go all the way to kind of purple, and each time along the way you will be reminded of this. Either your kind of first day of school when you were receiving the new textbook and kind of found these images, or just like, essentially reminding you of these kind of mnemonic devices that immediately start popping up in your head whenever you see somebody talking about colors. And of course that big red M had to somehow reappear, because again, that's like the most important logotype there is as far as Moscow subway goes. So this is a proposal. So like literally M becomes M, and there you are inside. Of course, we found out about a year ago that somebody kind of used this idea before, or just before, I think, or actually at the same year. So I guess there is such a thing as zeitgeist and such a thing as sort of ideas are happening there. So this is a metro stop in Warsaw, which also uses M for metro. But anyway, so this is inside, and you can see these kind of the dots of the tiles becoming signage, and there are these like pheasants hidden everywhere. And then this is what we call the decision-making circle, because it's in a circular line, which is sort of atypical for, like, the only other precedent we can think of is Tokyo also has a circular line, which means that you can go in any direction, you're going to end up there anyway. So, and that's basically the point of this thing. This is the circle that shows you where the stations are, so you kind of make your own mind whether you're going left or right. And there is a kind of a corresponding map on the ground that shows the Kremlin in the center, because again, everybody knows where it is, and then like the relative location of the stations. And another thing, kind of like there's sort of several, I guess, self-discoveries. I mean, there's a little bit of therapy to some degree coming along the project. So this is a book that my father had from 1968, which is basically about Moscow, illustrated by this guy, German Cheremishkin, who's still around. So we used those people in our renderings. And the reason being, again, like 1960s, late 1960s is a time kind of full of hope, full of excitement, full of like, Stalinism is over, there's maybe something going on. So there's a kind of uplift in the collective understanding of what of the future. So again, the 60s somehow seem to remind people of some kind of hope and possibility. So that's why we kind of hearken on this one. But at the same time, 60s were, there was like kind of another dimension to this thing. So this is Kudelka's image of Prague in 1968. So at the same time, while in Moscow everybody was kind of hopeful, people of Prague were not. So we kind of used that image in there as well, just as a kind of a reminder of all these things. And then finally, there was this kind of humongous empty floor, ceiling area that we're supposed to do something, because it was a given by those Madrid designs, and it was kind of a strange shape, and the shape really reminded me of a drawing that I've seen, and I couldn't figure out what it was until I remembered. This is that little blip of Leonidov's heavy industry building, which was like super colorful, and actually was literally the right shape. Again, it's kind of emerged from some kind of a strange memory, and we said, okay, fine, so we'll just use that as our ceiling mosaic, essentially. And then, while we're talking about Leonidov, he was designing these kind of strange sort of future urbanities that are not necessarily located anywhere. And we're given the site, which was basically like that. I mean, there was not even a drawing on it. It was just an empty site. So we said, okay, well, if we don't know what's there, maybe we'll at least allude to the past to some degree. So this is our site plan. We literally kind of located our station in one of Leonidov's clubs for the workers. And this is the kind of final image of the submission, like I said, the competition that we first won and then didn't, which basically uses 1968 drawing with slight modifications, so there are people reading on iPads and iPhones these days. Well, and that's sort of that, except if I please can have one more minute.
What do you guys think? Yes. 1 more minute? Yes? All right.
Okay, thank you. Because while I was preparing this thing, I realized, like, well, I do have a kind of a subway thing. So before this, we did this competition for the subway sukkah, which is coming actually now, like the festival of Sukkot, where you're supposed to make these sukkahs and sort of celebrate these things. So in 2010, there was this invited competition for Union Square, like 12 of these things were supposed to be built, and when we thought, like, you know what, why build one when you can basically, like, there is one already built, just kind of put the roof on it and be done with it. So that's what we proposed. And then it turned out, and of course we didn't win, nothing happened, but then it turned out a documentary came out, and apparently it was half of the documentary is them, the jurors, fighting over our entry. The kind of the freedom of expression and religious space versus public space and so on, which I thought was interesting. And then another one is even earlier project, which had to do with like New York Architecture League asked us to do essentially a public action in like 24 hours. And we said, okay, well, the only thing we can think of is even for like a seasoned New Yorker, when you emerge from the subway, you're really, really disoriented. You don't know where the hell you are. So you're looking for something to tell you, or you have to like run over to the block and see where, like the street sign. And of course, there are some cities that actually are generous enough to tell you the direction. So like this is on the right, an image from Kyoto. So, but we thought that somehow general geographic direction is not really enough. New York tends to operate on landmarks. So, you know, Bronx is up, Battery is down, that kind of thing. And this was at the time when this whole kind of memorial of World Trade Center was like still raging on, and it wasn't happening, and nobody was really happy with it. And we realized that somehow the memory was fading, but there was a very important mnemonic, well, not so much mnemonic, but the visual kind of landmark that these two towers, like depending on their orientation, could actually tell you where you are in the city if you look at them. So, under the cover of darkness, we essentially installed this kind of a dual project, which is both kind of a distributed memorial to World Trade Center, but at the same time also kind of a direction sign. So for those who get out of the subway and don't know where they are, at least this thing would show them. So it's like literally infiltrated this kind of the New York City subway signage. And it was actually there for a couple of months until somebody realized that you probably shouldn't be there. So on that note, thank you, and thank you for the extra minute.